Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kate Tracy. I'm the Communications Coordinator with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And today we'll be talking with report authors for our latest report, Tracking Decarbonization in the Southeast. Just a couple of technical notes. We are accepting questions for this webinar. If you have one, please submit it through the Q&A box located on your Zoom screen. And if you're with a media publication, we ask that you please denote that when you're submitting your question. If we do not get to all of the questions in this webinar, our report authors will follow up with you via email. To start us off, I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Stephen Smith, who's the Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone for joining. It's a privilege to be able to lead off the third annual Tracking Decarbonization in the Southeast report that SACE's technical team has done. This year is particularly important because we are beginning to see some of the Southeast utilities to set targets on carbon reductions and even begin discussing getting to zero carbon emissions or net zero carbon emissions, depending on how they're defining it. It's a critical time because obviously the impacts to the natural environment are continuing to accelerate with the emissions of greenhouse gases. And the utility sector is absolutely critical in the strategy for decarbonization, because not only are we talking about decarbonizing the fuel sources that are used to generate the critical commodity of electricity, but when we start to look at the transportation sector, it is absolutely imperative that we clean the grid in order to decarbonize the transportation sector. As we move to more and more electric vehicles, it's important that the grid continues to clean up. And so the utilities are a fundamental piece of the puzzle to decarbonizing not only the utilities, but also the transportation sector. We are also, this year is also critical because we've obviously had a change in administration. There's a very robust debate. The current administration is building out a very capable domestic policy team on carbon. And there's a number of things that the Biden-Harris administration are doing to actually re-engage both internationally and also on the domestic front in really trying to lead on issues pertaining to carbon emissions. One of the critical factors is in the current discussions around infrastructure, there is a clean energy standard or clean electricity standard that is a key part of the discussions that if the infrastructure plan is to get through. And it is targeted specifically at the utility sector, and it is targeted specifically at both using carrots and sticks to move the utilities down the pathway to getting to zero emissions of carbon by what the Biden administration has pledged in their campaign pledges, 2035. So this is going to be a very interesting summer as we go through a number of interesting policy discussions in Washington and maybe look at legislation that actually targets really setting and locking in some of these commitments. So our report is going to be able to give you the ability to look at where we are, what's being said, how the rhetoric is matching the actions. Rhetoric never leads to carbon reductions if it is not followed by tangible actions. And so Heather and Maggie are going to walk you through in detail and with a lot of factual support where our leading utilities are in the Southeast and where we need to go to actually get the rhetoric to match the actions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Heather, and thank you for joining us on this important webinar. Heather?
Okay, thanks, Steve, for teeing that up for me. I wanted to start by briefly talking about SACE and the scope of the report, because there's a lot of ground to cover when it comes to decarbonization and what we need to do to get to zero and avoid the impacts of the climate crisis. But the focus of the report is a little bit more narrow than some of the discussions that are happening in the US and Washington. So for those of you who don't know, SACE is a regional organization with a fairly lengthy history of advocacy in resource planning and utility regulation that happens at the state level. So naturally, the focus of the report is on the electric power sector, or specifically electric utility companies in the Southeast. So the report is basically reviewing how decisions that are made in regulated resource plans contribute to carbon emissions. So those resource plans, called integrated resource plans, are really a key tool for decarbonization. And for those of you who aren't familiar, when we say decarbonization, what we're talking about is the transition of our power supply from fossil fuels to resources that emit lower levels of carbon, or ideally no carbon. So in order to do all that in the report, we track individual resource plans for larger utilities, as well as collecting federal data sources like EIA and FERC in order to look at both historical and projected future emissions. So the report is really reflecting what utilities have either reported to federal data collectors or what they planned and submitted to regulators through integrated resource plans. So all that to say, this is all really in their own words. And for all those reasons, there are going to be some topics that aren't included in the report, or that we touch on only briefly just because of the data constraints. And continuing with the scope of what's included in the report and what's not, here's a quick summary of the geographic coverage of the report, just so it's clear which utilities we're talking about. So the analysis in the report covers hundreds of utilities. That's everything from investor-owned utilities to municipally owned systems to electric membership co-ops of all sizes. As you can see from the map, there is partial coverage of some states. That's actually intentional, just because we're focusing on utilities where most of the decisions about which resources they use, those decisions are approved or even made by state regulators. So in the Southeast, we have mainly large vertically integrated utilities. They're regulated by state entities called public service commissions or public utilities commissions. Those are appointed or elected depending on the state you're in. So one quick example of a utility that isn't included in the report, but some might think of as being in the Southeast, would be Entergy Mississippi. So the reason that's not included is because they participate in interstate electricity market. They participate in MISO. So they're not grouped in with the rest of the utilities in the report. So we cover the entire state for Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. And we have nearly all of North Carolina and Tennessee. We're specifically including very, very small parts that participate in PJM. And then we cover Mississippi and Kentucky, the parts that are either TVA in blue or are part of Southern Company, which is red in Mississippi for Mississippi Power. Okay, so now we're digging into the data. We're going to start off by looking at electric utilities in the broadest context before drilling down a little bit further. We're looking at emissions in several different sectors, and the reason we're doing that first is because, as Steve mentioned earlier, part of the argument for decarbonizing the power sector is that it can actually enable further reductions in other sectors through electrification. Such as electric vehicles, electrified transportation. So looking at that, one quick thing to note about the ups and downs of power sector emissions that we look at in blue is that historically, utilities have actually been decarbonizing a lot faster than the transportation sector is growing. So you can see the transportation sector there in red. So the transportation sector recently became the largest regional source of carbon emissions, but as you can see here, it's really still followed pretty closely by the power sector. So there is a lot of interplay between those two sectors. And you'll also see that on the chart, I highlighted two periods of time in gray. The first, one is 2010 to present, and that's just the historical period for most of the report. But the reason that we're going back a little bit further in this particular chart is to look at the 2005 to 2007 timeframe. So that's the other area that's highlighted in gray on the chart. And the reason that I'm calling that out specifically is because many utility and city decarbonization goals are actually using a year sometime in that 2005 to 2007 time frame as their baseline. And that's notable because you can see in the chart that 2007 is actually the peak year for carbon emissions. So utilities are kind of setting the decarbonization, they're setting the terms there by choosing the peak as their reduction target. Okay, so now we're moving into where the utility plans are going to take us for individual utilities. So we're mostly highlighting some of the larger utility groups in the region. There are 5 main groups that we're looking at. So the first is TVA, Duke, Southern Company, NEXTERA, and Dominion. And together, those actually make up about 3/4 of regional emissions. Of course, those are composed of, each one of those systems is composed of smaller operating companies, but we're going to get to that a little bit later in the report. We've lumped together some of the smaller utilities, but among the larger utilities, Southern is the largest emitter of carbon at present, and that's expected to continue into the future. But the gap, the total emissions gap between Duke and Southern is kind of expected to tighten up by 2030, particularly because Duke is slowing down their reduction so much. So that's moving back to the regional total. It's pretty notable that the decline in emissions is really tapering off in the near future, and that's opposed to the sharper reductions that we've seen in the past decade. So if you look at 2010 to 2019, that is the historical / actual reductions, and those are quite steep at about 34% of total emissions reduced. Yet during 2020 to 2030, which is a very similar time frame in terms of number of years, the expected emissions reductions are about half that in terms of the total decrease during a very similar time frame. And the primary reason for this is because emissions reductions from 2010 to 2019 were the result of retiring coal generation and replacing it with fossil gas. However, you really reached the point of diminishing returns with fuel switching, and at this point, fossil gas is the dominant fuel in the region with about 45% of total generation. With all that said, we're next going to take a look at the different types of resources that utilities use and what they're choosing to build or continue to operate for that matter, and how much power they're going to use in the future. And so we're doing all that so we can learn about how the decisions that utilities are making their plans might actually be holding us back from fully decarbonizing. Okay. So this is a snapshot of currently operating and planned resource capacity by both resource type and the year it was built. I thought this was a pretty interesting way to look at things because we get a window into how utilities kind of have a favorite resource type or go-to for a new generation, but that's really shifted over time. So it's obviously vanishingly rare for new coal generation to be constructed, but older units from the 70s, the 60s, and even the 50s are still being operated. You see kind of a similar rise and fall out of favor with nuclear as well. Before moving on to the fossil gas era, where we're still kind of stuck today. There are planned solar capacity additions in future years, but it's still relatively even with fossil gas. And obviously this chart is looking at the nameplate capacity for each resource type, and that doesn't necessarily translate to how much electricity is produced. So that's what we're going to look at in the next slide. We're going to take a look at the resource mix, or the combination of different resources that make up generation in the Southeast. And one other thing to note here is that in the past couple of years, utilities have been predicting flat or low growth. And that was another major factor in the historical emissions reductions that we saw in the previous couple of slides. Basically, that's because the less power you have to produce, the less emissions you produce. Okay, but in terms of fossil fuels, by 2030, more than half of the region's generation is still going to be coming from fossil fuels, with some coal usage still lingering. I think I mentioned in the previous slide that currently fossil gas makes up about 45% of generation in the Southeast, and that's only expected to increase. And while there is still a lot of utility investment in solar, and it shows no signs of slowing, it's really difficult to achieve further emissions reductions even when adding solar if so much of the generation is coming from fossil fuels. Well, one other thing to note here is that the operating licenses for existing nuclear plants are kind of moving into uncharted territory after 2030. So that's when a lot of the nuclear plants are going to need renewed licenses to operate beyond 60 years. And of course, currently the only nuclear plants, the only new nuclear unit in construction is Plant Vogtle in Georgia Power Service territory. So we're looking at the regional total here, but of course this varies from state to state and utility to utility. So now we're looking at basically the same information, but we're breaking it out into state instead. And I know that they're a little small, but the purpose here is of having all the states next to each other is to just show the orders of magnitude between different states. For instance, even if you combined North and South Carolina, together those two states still just barely reach the generation needs of large states like Florida. And I think it's pretty interesting here because Florida has probably the most obvious chunk of yellow or solar here, but even that makes it still difficult. Even with those solar additions, it's still difficult to reduce emissions just due to all the blue fossil gas you see here. It's a very considerable portion of the state. And also some other general insights from comparing state profiles here. Most states are reducing coal down to just a little sliver, aside from Alabama, and even North Carolina is keeping a little bit online. Some states like North Carolina and Tennessee are pretty dominated by nuclear, although they are unfortunately adding new gas in the future. And so basically, this is all just to give a quick snapshot of the resource mix of these different states, because the different resources translate into different amounts of carbon produced when you're burning fuels. So next, we're going to head back into the emissions figures. And so in this chart, we are looking at the per megawatt hour carbon emissions. This measure is sometimes called carbon intensity or emissions intensity. So as I said, when consumed, different fuels emit different amounts of carbon for each megawatt hour of electricity produced. So in this case, a lower emissions intensity number is simply showing that a state or utility has lower emissions relative to the size of their electricity load. And I should quickly note that looking at the emissions intensity does have value just because it makes it easy to compare one utility to another, but that isn't necessarily useful in the context of comparing one utility to zero. So even a relatively low emitting utility can contribute a lot to emissions if they're serving a lot of customers and have to produce a lot of electricity. Okay, so this is looking at the emissions intensity in 2019, but back in 2010, the regional average was about 1,100 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. So we're down to 833 in 2019. That's a pretty significant decrease already. And coincidentally, the emissions intensity of the average Southeast utility is just about the same as the average for a combined cycle fossil gas plant. Another insight here you can see is that there's a pretty big range in emissions intensity from just under 1,200 down to almost 600. And since there is such a wide range, we're going to take a closer look at this by breaking this down further into just the states and then just the utilities. So looking at the states now, down at the bottom, you can see Tennessee is the lowest emitting state in the region at about 592, although North Carolina is a fairly close second at 640. This is actually flipped from last year, and it could flip again in the future, depending on the outcome of some very key regulatory decisions that are being made in North Carolina related to the Duke IRP, which Maggie's going to talk about in just a minute. You can see that Mississippi is grouped pretty close to the Southeast regional average. And one thing that's notable is that the Florida utilities are now effectively tied with Alabama. So although Alabama is still a very coal-heavy state, it does have some nuclear. And again, Florida has that just very high reliance on fossil gas with some coal usage still lingering. And again, like looking specifically at Florida, one insight is that there's actually a lot of diversity in terms of emissions rates within Florida. It's a very big state, lots of utilities. So we're going to continue to further break this down by looking at the same chart with just the utilities highlighted. So up at the top, you can see that the three highest are Gulf Power, Duke Energy Florida, and Alabama. All three of those are well above the regional average and pretty close to the average emissions intensity of a generic fossil fuel plant. And then down at the bottom, we're going to go down to the bottom of the chart. I'm going to highlight 4 utilities that are clustered fairly close together. We have utility as the lowest, which, as we mentioned in the state pages, flipped from the previous year. So TVA was previously a little bit behind Duke, but is now a little bit ahead. And then that's followed by 2 of the Duke utilities in the Carolinas, Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas. Then we also have Florida Power and Light, which are all below the Southeast regional average. So I know I mentioned a lot of Duke utilities. So one thing to keep in mind is the relationship between some of these companies. The larger systems that I mentioned in some of the first slides are actually made up of multiple operating companies. So that's why when I say Duke Energy, in the context of this report, I'm referring to the total of Duke Energy Progress, Duke Energy Carolinas, and Duke Energy Florida. And obviously, there's a lot of challenges that come with these large parent companies operating in multiple states, and that matters a lot when it comes to utilities reaching their decarbonization goals, because an individual operating company might differ significantly in terms of emissions and in terms of ability to reduce emissions through state regulatory processes. So with that, I'm next going to hand this over to Maggie Shober, who's going to take us through some of the challenges that utilities face, or the decarbonization faces, in terms of resource plans. And she's also going to give some high-level views of the utilities that I just mentioned.
Great, thanks, Heather. All right, so we're going to take a look at 4 of the largest utilities in the region, actually 4 the largest utilities in the country. But first, I wanted to have a little snapshot, because we hear a lot about decarbonization from from the utilities themselves, from the states, from regulators, from policymakers, and we wanted to at least take our crack at breaking that down. Who's saying what does it really mean, and that's what we've presented here in this table. So just going left to right for the different columns, all of these utilities have talked about decarbonization, how they have reduced emissions in the past, which is true, and talked about something about reducing emissions into the future. Taking one step to the right, have they announced a goal? Do they have a target? Yes, most of them do. And then another step to the right, is that goal getting them to either zero or net zero? And in that category, we've listed just Duke Energy and Southern Company, both of which have a goal to get to what they call net zero at or by 2050. And then more importantly, are they including these in their IRPs? IRP is Integrated Resource Plan. And so are they actually, going through and planning around these goals? So far, what we've seen is Duke Energy in the Carolinas has included a scenario in their IRP. And we can get more into that later, because it's a little wishy-washy whether they are actually having that as their main plan, or if they are, is that sort of a side modeling exercise, and to some degree that question is still out. And unfortunately, the last 2 columns on this in this table on the right show none of these 4 utilities are on track to decarbonize by 2050. And in fact, what we did is look at the pace of decarbonization over the next decade based on their current plans, what they say they're going to do as of today. And if they were to continue on that rate past 2030, when would they reach zero? And some of the results were quite startling. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into each of those utilities and start off with Duke. So Duke Energy is one of, if not the biggest utility in the country. Here since we're focusing on the Southeast, we're looking at 3 of their operating utilities, Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. Both operate in North and South Carolina, where Duke Energy Florida, as is obvious, they operate in Florida. And we do see a pretty stark discrepancy between the operating companies as well. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, Duke's 2 utilities in the Carolinas, Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress, both released resource plans last September that included 6 scenarios, 2 of which were decarbonization scenarios, and 1 of which was a new gas scenario. But here we have modeled their base case with a carbon, and you can see that while they do expect declines in carbon emissions over the next decade, 15 years or so, It's not on a trajectory to get to zero by 2050, let alone by 2035, which is a stated goal of the Biden administration. We also see a discrepancy between operating utilities in Florida, whereas we see that Florida, Duke in Florida is not seeing the kinds of carbon declines in the 2020 to 2030 timeframe. They actually average a slight uptick. But if you look a little bit farther out, they do have a pretty major coal retirement that they have planned for 2034. So that's where we see kind of that drop in the red line just before the end there. And so that is a drop in emissions, but it is still pretty far out there. All right, on the next utility we're going to look at is Southern Company. So they operate 3 utilities in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. And the biggest driver of Southern Company's emissions trajectory that we see in their current plans is Plant Vogtle coming online, and then a few coal retirements in the near term. Just as we saw with Duke Energy, we do also see a discrepancy between operating companies in Southern Company. There is a pretty clear, from this table, it's pretty clear that Georgia Power is really driving the decarbonization, and the overall Southern Company averages are being pulled down by Mississippi Power and Alabama Power operating companies. I will note that Mississippi Power is going through an IRP process right now, so we don't have that updated IRP, within this analysis, and that could change, from what we've seen from preliminary, statements and what's been put out by Mississippi Power about the IRP so far is we're not expecting a huge change, but we're hoping to be surprised about that. All right, and I would say one last thing on Southern Company, that while we do see the decarbonization rate slowing, we do that 2.3% average reduction in Georgia Power is a result of not only Plant Vogtle, but some amount of both solar and energy efficiency going on in that by that utility. All right, next up is NEXTERA, where just a quick reminder, we talk about NEXTERA instead of Florida Power and Light because Florida Power and Light's parent company NEXTERA bought Gulf Power from Southern Company, and they're still in the process of merging the two and becoming one, operating them together. So looking at this chart, what we have seen is that the story for Florida Power and Light in particular has been that they are adding solar to bring down their emissions, but because of the heavy reliance on gas, that's the opportunities for them to kind of further decarbonize are drying up, because if you're adding new gas to the system and expecting to see load growth, you're going to get kind of diminishing returns from that strategy. And we have seen NEXTERA apply that strategy to Gulf Power in their latest 10-year site plans, which is as close to an IRP as we get in Florida. Those were released on April 1st, and Gulf Power's NFLs were combined again this year, and we're seeing some encouraging signs in that there was more solar for both of those companies this year than last year. But, again, we're seeing some expansion on the gas side there. And another piece that really could get NEXTERA to, a better now in Florida to update a policy called FICA. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Maggie.
Internet is unstable. Okay, apologies.
You lost me for just a second, but we can hear you again.
Okay, I was talking about how Florida Power and Light and Gulf Power NEXTERA could do more on energy efficiency, and that would help its emissions trajectory. There's an ongoing process right now where the state of Florida is updating its rules around energy efficiency, and whether they're just going to kind of tweak around the edges or really improve these rules that have been in place for decades and not updated. And so that's a real opportunity for NEXTERA and other utilities in the state of Florida to kind of switch around and really go big on energy efficiency to reduce emissions, as well as reduce everyone's electric bills. All right, and then the last utility, we have one more utility to go through, and that is TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. So TVA does not have an official stated goal on decarbonization. Instead, they have announced the emission reductions that are associated with their current plans. I know this sounds like a nuance, but we don't consider that a goal because plans can change. And in addition to that, their current plans do not show reductions that would get to zero by either 2035 or 2050. Whereas instead, we at SACE think that TVA can and should be a leader on decarbonization. They are, well poised to lead on this for a number of reasons. They have very strategic existing resources in the amount of hydro that they have on their system, excuse me, including a very large pumped hydro that is very useful when you are integrating renewable resources. They're directly controlled by the federal government. They're in a strategic location, kind of in the Mid-South, where they can access, through transmission, they can access wind in the Midwest, and really serve as a kind of intersection point for that with the rest of the Southeast. And then finally, but probably most importantly, is that TVA has a history of really meeting the moment when the nation needed it, and we feel like now is the time, and TVA is the utility to step up and provide that leadership. All right, and then
Maggie, it seems like we've lost you again.
Hear me okay?
Okay, yes. If you could just restart this slide, please.
Yes. So where do we go from here? There are a number of opportunities to bend that decarbonization curve down to meet the needs of climate science. These are just a few. As we all know, there's no silver bullet to this challenge, but here are some important things to highlight. I'll go through quickly because I think we want to save time for plenty of questions. But first, electrification, leveraging a cleaner electric sector to decarbonize other sectors through electrification, really would reduce emissions across the economy. So even with the current emissions profile of electricity in the Southeast, an EV can drive for 92 miles on the kilowatt hour charge with an equivalent emissions impact of a gallon of gas. And that is what's possible today, and that's only going to get better as the grid gets cleaner. So other sectors are prime for electrification as well, such as buildings and even some industrial practices. And then below electrification, we have resource planning. This is often referred to by its acronym of IRP, or Integrated Resource Plans. And this is possibly the most impactful process or thing on folks' day-to-day lives that they have never heard of or don't understand. And this is where utilities make near-term and long-term resource investment decisions. We at SACE are engaged in this process with utilities all across the Southeast where possible, and we see it and continue to see it as a key opportunity to push for further investment in clean energy resources like renewables, energy efficiency, and storage. And just a note on that, we often have opportunities for members and folks to get involved. So keep an eye out for action alerts in your area or your state on resource planning. It's really a great way to get involved. And then up at the top right, just transition. This term can encompass a lot of ideas. The way that we are thinking about it in this context is that there's kind of a key overarching theme that the importance that our work and the changes to the current system that we're working on, that they should improve on systemic racial, economic, and class disparities and not exacerbate them, especially since a lot of these disparities are only getting worse with the ongoing climate crisis. So we need to keep in mind how different communities are impacted, both as we design decarbonization strategies and as we are implementing them. So that is a constant and ongoing process. And then at the bottom right, looking, kind of zooming out quite a bit and looking federally, one thing that's important to note is that federal policy can have an outsized impact on the Southeast because the Southeast lacks a competitive electric market and state renewable or efficiency standards that what happens at the federal level can have a larger impact in the Southeast than other parts of the country where they're already moving towards clean energy resources because of these these state policies or these markets. In addition, the Southeast is poised to benefit from federal action on climate, especially because there will probably be financial incentives involved that will help utilities both retire fossil assets and invest in clean energy. There's a decent or a large manufacturing and supply chain located here in the Southeast, including vehicle manufacturing that can be converted to EVs and other clean energy manufacturing already in the region. And it's a good place for expansion of that manufacturing capacity. And certainly not least, but I'll close with that the Southeast is home to a number of frontline communities. We have a lot of states with a lot of coastlines, and we have a lot of communities that are either that are already feeling the brunt of damage from the burning of fossil fuels and the impacts of climate change. So what we can do to avert the worst of this crisis will help in those situations. All right, only one more slide and then we'll get to questions. So here's an overview of where we are as a region. This is, the 4 utilities that I've talked about specifically, but it includes much more than that. It's all of the utilities in the region that Heather described earlier in the presentation. So, I mean, the first takeaway is that The red line shows current utility plans, and they are above both the orange and green lines, which show a linear trajectory to get from today to zero by either 2035 or 2050. And we're not on track. We as a region are not on track to meet those, to get to zero. There are a few bright spots. One that I just want to mention briefly is that Dominion in South Carolina, we were able to get their modified IRP into this analysis, and that was an improvement over the IRP that they submitted last year. From an emission standpoint, just the background there is that Dominion South Carolina did submit an IRP to the South Carolina Public Service Commission, which is their regulator, and the Public Service Commission shot it down. They said, no, this doesn't meet our standards, and try again. And Dominion turned around an IRP, a modified IRP fairly quickly in a couple of months, which is quick for an IRP process. And we see better energy efficiency, renewables in that plan. There's still a number of things we'd like to see in Dominion's resource plan moving forward, and that is an ongoing process. We're in a stakeholder process with Dominion that's going on right now, but we have seen improvement, and that is just an example of this is how the process can work, and stakeholder involvement can make a difference. Unfortunately, that's a bright spot. Unfortunately, there are other smaller utilities within this data set that through 2020 through 2035 are set to continue increasing emissions even over the next decade. And so there's a number of folks that are bringing that line even more off track. But with that, the final note that I'll end on is that if you're read our report from last year or were on our webinar from last year, we had this same chart, and you can see if you compare the two, that this year we're seeing a better trajectory. So we're closer to where we need to be. We're still pretty far off track, but there has been incremental improvement since last year. And with that, I think if we can open up to questions.
Yeah, thanks Maggie and Heather for your deep dive and insights on the report. Just a reminder to everyone, there's been a couple of questions. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send the recording as well as a slide deck from the webinar in addition to the actual report. So all of the information on the report will be sent in a follow-up email. But to go ahead and let's just talk about how the data was collected in the report. We have a question that asks, how can we trust the industry to accurately self-report? Heather, can you answer that question?
Yeah, I'll take this question, but I'd like Maggie to also jump in if she has any thoughts. My basic answer would be that most people probably wouldn't trust the industry to accurately self-report. But I mean, if this question is pertaining to the report more generally, I'd say that, the report figures are calculated not based on the carbon emissions that the utilities are reporting, but by the fuel that is being consumed and their generation forecast and their load forecasts. So there are some calculations there that account for smaller plants. And one thing that's unique about this report that you won't really see in utilities reporting is that this accounts for power purchases between utilities. So one example of this, and I mentioned this on the Southern Company page, but they report carbon emissions based on if they have financial control, or basically if they own the power plant. but there are actually many utilities in the region that have a significant amount, they buy a significant amount of coal from other plants. So if everyone were to use that standard, there'd be a lot of emissions that wouldn't be accounted for. And then I think my second the second part of my answer to this question is that it's not even necessarily a matter of the industry reporting the information accurately, because I think information offered by utilities may actually be factually accurate, but it's still misleading because it's only one part of the story. So one example of this in the report is that there are a couple of utilities that claim to have decarbonization goals, but they're only really doing per megawatt hour reductions. And that's really only one part of the story. It's not a perfect measure to only look at the emissions intensity, because if it's looking at per megawatt, you can still be using a lot of megawatt hours, and that contributes to emissions. And then another part of that is that utilities might be offering information which again is accurate, but then they'll offer they'll offer up poor plans or poor advice on how to decarbonize, and that's harmful because it can appear like utilities are making good plans or giving good advice to regulators about how to decarbonize. And it only appears that way because it does relate to accurate information, but then, it's easy to misinterpret the significance or completeness of that information. So I think that's my basic answer. Maggie, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I thought that that covered it pretty well. I will say, what Heather's talking about is that utilities do have to report their fuel use to the Energy Information Administration and a number of other key statistics from their actual operations of how much they're operating each power plant and such like that. So we do use that information in our analysis. And then, when we're looking at future emissions, we are looking at that load forecast, and we're looking at IRPs and pulling it all in from there. All right, next question.
Okay, this next question is on more looking at reductions. It says, it seems like the transition from coal to gas didn't achieve much reduction in carbon emissions. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, I'll just speak to that briefly because I think it's a pretty simple answer, which is, on a 1 megawatt out, per megawatt hour basis, if you switch from coal to gas, you're going to cut your emissions approximately in half. I mean, that's not entirely accurate. And I will note that that's only the direct emissions from combustion and don't include any upstream emissions. So for instance, through the gas production and transportation process. And so, that's where we see, even if you replaced all the coal in the system 100% with gas, you're going to reduce them approximately in half. And so obviously that's only getting us half the way there.
Okay, great. So this next question is more of a deep dive on the generation mix. We're going to combine a couple of questions here. One of them is, can personal solar systems have any substantial impact on decarbonization? Is the scale too small to be a major contributor? And in addition, how does utility power generation forecast take into account homeowner-owned solar system and decrease demand from utilities? So I think those can be combined together.
I think that combining residential solar or solar that's on commercial properties, combining enough of those together, and you can have a pretty major impact. We see some benefits of these resources. They're obviously located very close to the load. and they can provide additional resiliency benefits, especially when paired with home storage systems, are just a couple of key benefits. So I think that they can have an impact. How they're treated by the utility varies depending on the utility. Some of them kind of lump that in with their load analysis, and some have it separately in their generation, but it is accounted for.
Okay, and one more question on that before we dive into more specifics on states and utilities. If we could get utilities to encourage or incentivize residential solar panels, wouldn't that not only reduce emissions by adding to the clean energy generation, and also reduce collective demand over time?
Yes, it would. And that is those are policies that SACE has been supportive of in the past and continues to be. And one of the issues that we have is that the way that utilities, get their revenue and are profitable, or even break even if they are a public power utility, is often off track with incentivizing residential solar, and that's where we have had we've butted heads with utilities on this issue, and I think it needs an aligning of incentives so that the utility is not disincentivized disincentivized for having more of their customers have solar, either on their homes or businesses.
Okay, thank you. So getting more into some specifics on states and utilities, Southern Company says it's ahead of schedule on its interim 50% greenhouse gas reduction goals. Do you agree with their estimate on that? It sounds like we're saying that Georgia Power is doing better than other utilities than Southern. Would you say Georgia Power is actually doing a good job or on track, or is just better comparatively?
I can take this one. So to break this question down into two parts, Southern Company says it's ahead of schedule on the interim goal. Do you agree with this estimate? Yes, I agree with that estimate, but I don't actually think the interim goal is really that instructive for reducing total emissions. One of the first slides of the webinar was kind of pointing out that 2007 was the peak of power sector emissions, and I was pointing that out with Southern Company in mind specifically because that is the baseline that they're using. So I think when you're picking the absolute highest point, a 50% reduction isn't really that noteworthy. But yes, they are on schedule for that interim reduction. And then the second part of the question is, it sounds like you're saying Georgia Power is doing better than the other utilities in Southern Company. I'd agree with that assessment. I think we actually show some increases in emissions reductions from sister companies like Mississippi Power, but it should be noted that that's still kind of hanging in the balance because Mississippi Power is conducting their first kind of regulated IRP. And so there are definitely, opportunities there for further emissions reductions. And then I think the last part of this question is, would you say Georgia Power is actually doing a good job / on track or just better comparatively? I'd say just better comparatively, but I'm not even sure if I would use the word better. Although they're reducing more in comparison to the other utilities, but they're still missing opportunities. One of the things that we point out in the report is that in 2019, Georgia Power had an IRP process. They underwent their IRP process knowing that the parent company had the net zero by 2050 goal in place, and that still wasn't addressed in the IRP itself. So I just felt like that was a missed opportunity.
Thanks, Heather. And I do realize that we are over on time here. So if anyone has to hop off, just know that we will send the recording out. But we're going to squeeze in 2 more questions. On slide 11, if you combined Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas, would those amounts be added to each other or be averaged? In other words, would Duke North Carolina jump to the top or remain near the bottom?
So I think that, so this question is asking about Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas, which are actually relatively similar in terms of emissions intensity. And I think it's asking about slide 11. So I'm not sure if they meant Duke Energy Florida instead. But to kind of make an attempt at answering this question, if you combined all the Duke operating companies in the Southeast to look at the emissions intensity, it would still be a little bit below the regional average. It'd be about 740 pounds per megawatt hour. So below the regional average, but it would still, it would still go up. This is mostly due to Duke Energy Florida, which has the far higher emissions intensity than the other 2 Duke operating companies. Changing around the addition of, I think, Duke Energy Progress wouldn't matter that much, just because there's less load for that particular utility.
Yep, and I'll refer that whoever asked that question to page 15 of the report. We actually have the overall Duke average emission rate from 2019. So.
Okay, and last question. This is looking at Tennessee. How does the TVA plant retirement process work? Can the Biden administration choose to require plant closures, studies, or shutterings, or is there a separate process that takes place?
So I would answer that to say all of the above are possible. So TVA, while it is unique in some ways, it operates, like the other utilities. It can, there are a number of ways that a retirement decision could be made at TVA. TVA staff can, make a recommendation. They've done the analysis. This plant is no longer economic, and they're choosing to retire it. And that requires approval by the TVA board, which serves as the regulator of TVA, similar to the state level public service commissions, except for that it's appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. The other way that it could happen is a little bit more top down. So the TVA board could direct TVA to analyze their coal plants, their fossil plants, their gas plants, or specific power plants, and set a plan for retirement. And the president can send directives or to the TVA board, asking them to do so. So you can go from kind of the highest level on down that way. And if the TVA board is not acting on what the president would like, then the president does have the ability to remove board members from that regulating body, as we saw happen just last year. So a number of questions, a number of ways.
There sure are. Okay, well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up since we're a little bit over time. We do realize that we did not get to all of the questions on the webinar, so we will follow up with you all for some clarification and answers to those. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thanks to report authors Heather and Maggie for another great report, and stay tuned for an email from us with links to the report, the recording of this webinar, and a webinar slide deck. Thanks so much for joining and have a great day.